All right, welcome everybody. It is Tuesday morning, April 19th, 2022. I'm Eli Sagor with the University of Minnesota Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative based at the Cloquet Forestry Center. Glad to have you all here, and I'm glad to have our speaker here, Rachel Dube. We are, even though it's April, we're kicking off our 2022 SFEC and University of Minnesota Extension Forestry webinar series now. We've had a couple of other seminars that I know some of you have joined, hosted by the Department of Forest Resources here at the U. Those have been great. And actually, we have one more of those coming up this coming Monday with Kurt Kipfmueller, talking about stories from the rings of trees. That's going to be a good presentation, I know, from Kurt this Monday. We've got a couple of other things coming up that I just want to quickly review. If you're within striking distance of Ely, Minnesota, this Thursday evening, there's going to be a session focused on Indigenous perspectives on fire. There's really a wonderful 16-minute video called Ashkigin, featuring a number of folks from the Fond du Lac community and other communities in Minnesota. And on Thursday, at the historic State Theater in Ely, as they call it, a beautiful facility, will be hosting many of the people who appear in that video. Will be airing the video, and then you'll hear from a panel of, again, tribal folks involved in natural resources, and they'll be discussing the role of fire in natural resource management. So again, that's this Thursday evening, the 21st. There's no need to register. It's a free event. There will not be a live stream. It's at the historic State Theater in Ely. Without too much further announcement, I guess I'll just say, if you're interested in other events, take a look at our upcoming events page. There are a few other things there and some other things coming up. Those of you interested in continuing ed credits, look for a link later in this session in the chat. If you have questions for Rachel, because I know she's going to be covering a lot of ground, I encourage you to submit those anytime. You can use the chat or the Q&A function, whichever you prefer, and I'll be noting those and I'll share those with Rachel at the end of the presentation. With that, we're going to get going. Rachel is a DNR forest health specialist. She has been with the forest health team for a few years now. I want to say not too long, but time flies. What has it been, 3 or 4 years, Rachel?
Yeah, since 2019, and it has gone by very quickly.
Yeah, well, I remember when you were a grad student here pasting sensors to gypsy moth caterpillars and doing some really fascinating stuff. So, you're doing other things now, and we're going to hear about some of that. So I'm going to get off the screen. Rachel, the screen is yours, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today, Eli. And hello, everyone. As Eli said, I'm with the Minnesota DNR. I'm a regional forest health specialist, and I am based out of Brainerd. And for the next hour, I'll cover forest health observations from the last year in 2021. And I'll also make a few predictions for what we might expect to see in upcoming years. And because in my last virtual presentation, I had some connectivity issues, I'm going to turn my video off for now, but I'll turn it back on for the Q&A portion. But before diving into what we saw last year, I'll provide a brief overview of our DNR forest health team. All these people are responsible for the observations and data I'll be highlighting today. So we have 4 forest health specialists covering the state. And while our focus is on lands managed by the DNR, we frequently assist and collaborate with partners and private landowners on forest health issues. And I cover our Northwest region with my coworker, Megan O'Neill, who is based out of Bemidji. We also have Eric Otto, who is based out of the Northeast region, out of Grand Rapids. And last but certainly not least, we have Brian Schwingle as our Central Region Forest Health Specialist. He's based out of St. Paul, and he has given this talk through SFEC several times in recent years, so you may have heard from him. And also working out of St. Paul is our program coordinator, Val Cervenka. And while she is not on the photo on the right-hand part of this slide. The person on the left of the photo is Gentry Carlson from DNR Resource Assessment, and Gentry does most of our aerial survey flights. And the Minnesota DNR has used aerial surveys as a forest health monitoring tool since the early 1950s. After a one-year hiatus due to COVID-19 social distancing requirements in 2020, we were able to resume our annual aerial survey of forest health canopy conditions across the state last year. So it's good to get back to that. This map depicts the survey transects we flew back in 2021. And our surveys are done in collaboration between our DNR Forest Health Group, DNR Resource Assessment, and the USDA Forest Service Region 9 State and Private Forestry Field Office. And the results from our aerial surveys from the years 2016 through 2019, as well as last year's, can be found on the Minnesota Geospatial Commons webpage. The link for that page is up above on the upper part of the slide. And once you're there on the website, you can search using the keywords forest health to access our data. And we compile the results of our aerial surveys as well as on the ground investigations in our forest health annual reports. The 2021 report is available on our website, so I encourage you all to check it out when you get a chance. And the link to that page is at the bottom of the slide. Otherwise, it's pretty easily accessible on the left-hand menu of our Forest Health webpage. And on this webpage, you can sign up on the main page to receive a notification when we've released our annual report, and also to receive periodic forest health news updates from our team. To sign up, you can click this link at the bottom of our main page and enjoy all the latest and greatest in forest health news there. But now I'll kick it off with what we observed and saw in 2021. I'll start off with the new issues we saw last year, and then I'll move to cover ongoing issues we've been dealing with prior to 2021 later on in my talk. And as Eli said, I am going to cover a lot of information on a variety of issues and organisms. So after the webinar, you can access all of this information in our annual report, and there you can digest it all at a more leisurely pace. And I'm going to go through our observations in a somewhat chronological order. So I'll start off with an issue we first became aware of back in January 2021. So squirrels commonly strip off sugar maple bark in late winter and in early spring. And our team receives reports of squirrel feeding damage on trees in a lot of years, but typically no earlier than February. However, last year we started receiving reports in mid-January, so squirrels were feeding on bark early last year, and they went wild. We saw large areas of bark stripped away from branches and on the main bowl on sugar maples in several counties in central and east central Minnesota. Reports of feeding damage also came from Houston County in the southeast part of the state. A closer inspection revealed marks from tiny incisors scraped into the wood. And squirrels stripping bark can girdle trees, resulting in branch dieback, which shows up the following year of the damage. And if the branch isn't completely girdled, the tree will start to grow callus tissue on the damaged areas in an attempt to recover. And we were actually able to see clusters of scattered sugar maples with flagging and severe dieback in aerial surveys over Crow Wing, Morrison, and Pine counties last summer. And ground truthing some of these areas confirmed that squirrel damage was the culprit. And we on our team and others have speculated about the cause of this explosion in squirrel bark feeding in some areas of the state. John Ball with South Dakota State University suggested that weather conditions in 2020 may have concentrated sugars in tree bark and attracted squirrels more than usual. And we also know that acorns, of course, are an important food source for squirrels. And we had reports of very high acorn production in areas across the state from 2018 to 2020, potentially leading to higher squirrel populations in those areas. And this population increase would have, of course, then resulted in the need for an alternative winter food source. And finally, something else to consider was that November 2020 through January 2021 were actually much warmer than average, so that may have played a role as well. But ultimately, the cause of the great squirrel debarking of 2021, as I have dubbed it, still remains a mystery. Now, moving into the spring, our memories of the hot, dry summer of last year probably made many of us forget that there are tree damaging frosts in May of 2021. Frosts occurred in southern Minnesota in mid-May, and temperatures dipped into the 20s in locations ranging from Pine County, west to Todd County, and north from there. And, oh no, did I? Let's see, I think I hit the wrong way on my slide. Sorry about that, folks, going the wrong way. But back to frost, a late spring frost can damage or kill emerging leaves and stem tissues, especially on smaller trees and those located on the perimeter of woods. And tree species can be important too. Leaves of certain trees, such as oak and ash, can be more susceptible to frost damage than those of other broadleaf trees. We primarily saw damage to these species. And while symptoms of frost damage can look very alarming, healthy trees are usually able to re-leaf within a few weeks. And it doesn't really seem that frost damage hurts trees over the long term, but newly planted trees should be watered if conditions are dry, and then mulched if possible as they're establishing their new root systems. And another type of damage that occurred around this time last year was from the introduced basswood thrips. In late May, a retired DNR employee in central Minnesota expressed some concern for sickly basswoods. They're missing a lot of leaves, and the remaining leaves did not look healthy. And subsequent surveys revealed that from northern Wright County, west to northern Kandiyohi County, and then up to northern Stearns County, there are quarter-acre patches of basswoods that range from 25 to 80% defoliated, with only the outer rim of leaves remaining in the canopy, as you can see in this picture on this tree. And nearly all the mature basswoods at Birch Lake State Forest in Stearns County were heavily defoliated, and there's at least 200 acres of damage there. And we identified the culprit of this damage as the insect called the introduced basswood thrips. We last documented problems with this non-native pest in Minnesota in 1995, and before then from 1982 to 1988. So it hasn't been a big problem for a while. Adults feeding on developing buds and larvae feeding on elongating leaves in the spring. And these larvae are small and circled in the photo on the upper left-hand side. And their feeding causes leaf drop, curling, and tiny yellow-brown spots on the leaves. And introduced basswood thrips can affect basswoods in the same area for many years in a row, eventually stunting their crowns. And we expect introduced basswood thrips to be active again in central Minnesota this spring. But after a few years, predaceous insects or weather conditions will likely reduce populations. But otherwise, for this insect, there's really nothing we can do to manage for it in the forest in the meantime. But we are unaware of any long-term negative impacts to basswoods across Minnesota from introduced basswood thrips. Now, moving into the summer, we are what is probably the biggest forest health story of 2021, the intense drought that affected the entire state to some degree. Now, technically, this is not a new issue in some areas in northern Minnesota that have been dry for several consecutive years, but drought conditions in many areas of Minnesota were at historic levels last year. And statewide, Minnesota experienced its 9th driest growing season on records that date back to 1895. And this map here on the left depicts the ranking of severity of drought conditions during the growing season, which we define as April through September. And the brown areas in northern Minnesota and then in south central Minnesota were the driest to the 5th driest growing seasons of all time last year. But looking at the map, you can see that there are areas that were actually relatively wet last year, especially in the southern half of the state. So this map nicely illustrates the complexity of drought impacts across the landscape. And keep this in mind as I make some of my generalizations about the drought in my next few slides and its impact to trees in any given location. This is a fun little GIF I made. It's a graphic showing progression of drought throughout the growing season last year. And I made this using maps created by the US Drought Monitor. And this drought was hard on trees, and the effects will last for several years. Drought-stressed trees are less able to resist attack from insects and diseases that would not normally cause serious problems. And during and after a drought, trees are generally more susceptible to invasion by native pests like bark beetles, cambium borers, and root diseases. But these are the main impacts we observed from drought last year. The severe drought aided pine and graver beetles to attack recently thinned pine plantations in northwestern Minnesota, and drought and heat in June caused widespread leaf scorch on oaks in central Minnesota. And indeed, the month of June was very hot, and these high temperatures compounded the early impacts of the drought and caused acute stress symptoms in some trees. We saw premature leaf loss as well, and that is an adaptation to excessive heat and dryness. Leaf scorch and leaf loss were also documented during the drought of 1988 on bur oaks and maples after extreme heat that year. We saw that as well looking back at the drought of 1976 in our records. And the good news is that we expect most of these trees to survive. However, some previously stressed trees that were heavily affected will likely die. Looking at our younger trees, our Northeast Forest Health Specialist, Eric Otto, has done some preliminary regeneration surveys looking at impacts of drought on seedlings that were planted in 2021. And he found mortality exceeding 60% at the worst affected site in northern Minnesota that he observed. And we do plan to do additional surveys this spring in collaboration with the Minnesota DNR silviculture program. Our Northwest Regional Silviculturist shared some of his anecdotal observations with me, so it's not yet backed up by data, it will be. But what he saw is that he estimates between 60 and 80% of seedlings planted in 2021 across the Northwest region have died as a result of drought. And remember that parts of this region were in exceptional drought this year. You can see that on the map, and were dry in previous years. Now, he expects that number probably climbs somewhat over the winter months as drought-stressed trees were then exposed to winter conditions. And unfortunately, in many cases, too few seedlings and large plantings probably survived, so we will likely end up having to start over at some sites despite some survival. And he also observed some scattered mortality in 2 to 7 year old conifer plantations. And because seedlings typically take 3 to 5 years following planting to establish their root systems at a new site, these younger plantations last year were especially susceptible to drought damage. And drought also increased red pine mortality in northern Minnesota mature trees. In August, we began receiving reports from Roseau to northern Beltrami counties that red pines were suddenly turning red. Here's a photo of that on the left. Our investigations found signs and symptoms of rampant pine bark beetle attack, and these trees were infested in the summer, but the trees didn't turn color until winter. And this pattern was also observed in the 1988 drought year. And many of the affected stands had been thinned earlier in the season. Now, this so far has not been a widespread issue, certainly been showing up in northern Minnesota, but it was severe in some stands. And in normal weather conditions, bark beetles infest damaged trees and live in logging slash. Healthy trees are not really affected. But during a drought, however, bark beetles are able to overcome the tree's defenses and cause mortality by creating galleries under the bark that cut off the flow of water and nutrients throughout the tree. The beetles also carry blue stained fungi, that's in the upper right photo, and that fungi accelerates the death of the tree and can turn the wood a blue-green color, which can lower its value. Armillaria root rot is another issue in drought-stressed red pine. Armillaria is a native fungus that lives in the soil and decays the roots and lower trunk of the tree, eventually causing it to die. A healthy tree is less likely to be colonized by armillaria, but a tree can be overcome when drought stress, resulting in mortality. Then another effect of the drought was to give two-lined chestnut borer an edge over oak trees. Two-lined chestnut borer is a native metallic wood-boring bark boring beetle, not a bark beetle, sorry, feed beneath oak bark. Oaks stressed and weakened by serious droughts, windstorms, soil compaction, or intense and repeated defoliation by other forest insects are commonly attacked. Two-lined chestnut borer damage last year was made worse by drought, but past stressors definitely predispose oaks to further infestation. These stressors include fluctuations in precipitation over the past decade that range from very droughty conditions to historically wet periods alternating over the past decade. Also, a lot of our oaks in Minnesota are on private land, and many are past their biological rotation age and have never had any management interventions. So these older, more densely grown oaks are more susceptible to attack by two-lined chestnut borer. And in 2021, aerial surveyors mapped over 9,600 acres of damage from two-lined chestnut borer, and this is an increase from when we last surveyed in 2019. The damage was scattered this year and primarily located in central Minnesota. And this map showing counties with two-lined chestnut borer damage is really only approximate because we weren't able to extensively survey for this insect. So we'll have to watch and see how this map expands into this year. And even if we're not in drought this year and have an average or even above average precipitation, we can still expect a lot of stressed oaks to die in 2022 and 2023, potentially tapering off from 2024. And this mortality will not only be the result of two-lined chestnut borer attack, but also from armillaria root disease. Like in drought-stressed pine, the opportunistic armillaria fungus will infect weakened oak trees, often in combination with two-lined chestnut borer. And unfortunately, if we experience another dry growing season this year, we do expect that these patterns will be prolonged. And another unfortunate outcome of the drought is that it will be likely be difficult to distinguish two-lined chestnut borer from oak wilt in 2022 and 2023 especially. Oak wilt is an invasive disease that can kill red oaks very quickly. It can also kill burn white oaks. And I'll talk about it in more detail in a few minutes. But it's really important to be able to identify oak wilt so that it can be controlled and prevented from spreading to healthy trees. And the symptoms of two-lined chestnut borer can frequently look like those of oak wilt, but a distinct difference is that dead leaves stay on the tree when they are attacked by two-lined chestnut borer. You can see that on the photo on the right, while most leaves quickly fall off trees infected with oak wilt on the left. And while two-lined chestnut borer will usually kill an oak in 2 to 3 years, sometimes they'll even recover, severely stressed oaks can die just in one summer from two-lined chestnut borer. And this situation in particular is one that can especially look very similar to oak wilt. Oak wilt kills red oaks in about 2 months after infection. So it's going to be a challenging year. But warm, dry weather also possibly helped to promote increased populations of sap-sucking insects such as aphids, adelgids, and scales in 2021. Warm, dry conditions can accelerate the development of sap-sucking aphids and scales and can reduce the population of their natural enemies, such as fungi that require cool, moist conditions. Now, drought-stressed trees are also more susceptible, of course, to attack by these insects as well. These insects were primarily observed on broadleaf trees such as ash, aspen, oak, and black walnut. And sap-sucking insects excrete honeydew that is colonized by a black fungus called sooty mold. Here's a picture of that on needles that covers leaves, whole branches, and other plant parts. However, the fungus does not infect plants and is generally not a concern for tree health, even though it looks alarming. And if similar weather conditions continue into 2022, we are likely to see more sap-feeding insects. High populations can result in twig and branch dieback, but insect numbers may be reduced once populations of their natural enemies increase. And like the fungal enemies of the insects I just mentioned, the fungal pathogen, bur oak blight, was likely hampered by dry conditions last year. Incidence and severity of bur oak blight across the landscape seem to mirror rainfall patterns during leaf elongation, mostly in May. And bur oak blight is caused by a native fungus, which has likely been intensified by above average spring rainfall since the 1990s. And bur oak blight results in browning leaves that may drop prematurely in late summer. And our Central Region Forest Health Specialist, Brian Schwingle, has tracked bur oak blight incidents at several sites across central and southern Minnesota since 2017. And based on Brian's and the rest of our team's observations, we saw less bur oak blight in 2021 than in 2020. Only 1% of the almost 500 bur oak trees Brian surveyed across 10 sites were substantially defoliated by bur oak blight. But generally speaking, actually, only a small number of bur oaks in our surveys have been affected, never exceeding 5% in a year. And even when bur oak blight has defoliated trees in our survey, they have always recovered the following spring. And since bur oak blight is a relatively new phenomenon in the forest health world in Minnesota, we don't yet know much about its long-term impacts here on the state. Forest health staff have surveyed hundreds of bur oaks in central and southern Minnesota. We have found that bur oak blight can have a severe impact on individual bur oaks, especially if they were previously stressed, but most bur oaks are not severely affected by the disease, even though they can look pretty awful by the end of the summer. They tend to bounce back. And it's important to remember that bur oaks can lose up to 50% of their canopies each year, but still remain relatively healthy. And it really only becomes a problem when bur oaks lose more than half of their leaves for several consecutive years. Then it may become stressed and susceptible to other problems, such as two-lined chestnut borer and armillaria disease that can eventually kill the tree. And despite bur oak blight and the outlook for weather springs in Minnesota, bur oak is still definitely an excellent species for Minnesota's future forests. And to wrap up the year, the most notable wind damage in 2022 actually came right at the end of the year. I know this is a busy slide, but I really liked all these graphics. So you might remember seeing this on the news a few months ago, but after record high temperatures on December 15th, a derecho moving 60 to 80 miles per hour tracked from Kansas to Wisconsin overnight. And the picture on the right kind of shows that line. And southeastern and south central Minnesota were most affected. And Redwood Falls Airport measured a wind gust of 78 miles per hour that night. And there were 20 confirmed tornadoes on the ground. And if you recall from news reports, there had never been a tornado recorded in December in Minnesota ever before. There's actually at least one EF2 tornado in Minnesota, which struck the town of Heartland, pictured in the upper right. And our team plans to examine the extent of damage from the tornadoes and strong winds to forests later this year. And now moving to our next section, I'll cover issues that have already been developing in recent years. And pictured here is oak wilt, an issue that has long been affecting Minnesota's forests, but has moved into new areas in recent years. Now, oak wilt was first detected in Minnesota in the 1940s, but there was a significant change last year. Oak wilt has been slowly moving north in Minnesota, and we confirmed it for the first time last year in Crow Wing and Cass counties. There was just one pocket in Crow Wing County and 5 pockets in southern Cass County in 2 adjacent neighborhoods in that county. All of the pockets were on private land, and most landowners controlled it last fall. Forest health staff will continue to closely monitor the area as we expect that there are additional areas of infection nearby. Additionally, we will also be monitoring and controlling new infections over in Pine County at the arrow to the right. Now, all counties in Minnesota are at risk from oak wilt due to its ability to spread over long distances over infected firewood. But 41 counties are immediately threatened by the disease. Now, this map depicts areas which are considered at high risk of oak wilt infection because they are within a 20-mile buffer around confirmed locations with oak wilt. And a recent aerial image analysis project done by DNR Resource Assessment in 2020 found almost 11,600 oak wilt pockets in Minnesota, and you can see those mapped here. And this number is still likely an underestimate. But luckily with oak wilt, we are aided by its biology. On its own, it actually moves pretty slowly and inefficiently, so we stand a pretty good chance at slowing its spread in any area. The red spots on this map are confirmed oak wilt pockets from 1987 through present. And to date, we estimate that oak wilt covers about 40% of the area in Minnesota where most of our red oak species group grow in forests. So there are still many oak forests in Minnesota left to protect from oak wilt. So we're giving it our best shot. But unfortunately, oak wilt control can be expensive. So the DNR is partnering with Morrison County SWCD, who has received an Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund grant totaling over $400,000 to provide financial assistance to private landowners who want to control oak wilt on their properties on the northern edge of oak wilt in central Minnesota. And this includes areas outside of Morrison County. We did use these funds last year north of there. And so far, over 27 oak wilt infection centers have been treated using this grant, has made oak wilt control possibility for a number of landowners. And as I mentioned, we are also controlling new pockets located in Pine County, as well as exploring new cost-effective oak wilt control methods. Monitoring for the effectiveness of these methods is ongoing, but they do appear to be successful so far. And we also have general recommendations in an oak wilt guide for preventing the spread of oak wilt during forestry operations. You can find this guide on our oak wilt page on our DNR Forest Health website. And we're actually currently modifying some of the language that specifically addresses some of the considerations for forestry operations, and an updated version with those details will be posted hopefully very soon. Another issue that continued on last year was an interesting and extensive outbreak of red pine shoot moth that began in 2020. And as you can see on this map, the outbreak actually covered a good portion of the state. The last time there was a large outbreak of red pine shoot moth in Minnesota was back in the late 1990s. And we first noticed dead shoots on red pines in early 2020, most often along roadsides, plantation edges, or in more open grown stands. And after further investigation, we found that the outbreak extended from north of Bemidji to south of the Twin Cities. So it covered a very large area. And this pest most commonly affects trees that are more than 20 years old and grown in more open settings. But thankfully, the damage from this insect is not concerning. These caterpillars can only damage this year's shoot growth, so they can't kill branches. An attacked red pine can easily tolerate this sort of damage for a number of years. And here's a photo on the left of the damage caused by red pine shoot moth. As you can see, about the last 2 inches of growth is killed by this insect. And here on the right is a photo of the caterpillar itself extracted from inside the shoot. This outbreak was still ongoing in the areas that we had previously surveyed in 2020, but the damage was already lessened compared to the first year of the outbreak. And we don't anticipate the outbreak will extend more than a few years, as we already found evidence of disease and parasitism in many sample caterpillars last year. And also in 2020, We observed another interesting insect. This is a caterpillar, Gretchena amatana, a tortricid moth with no common name. And this insect was defoliating black walnuts and encasing some trees in heavy silk across 60 acres in Fillmore County. So it was a very striking symptom. And the white you can see on this photo and left on this tree is all webbing. And here are some close-up photos of the webbing and the caterpillar. Now, this was the first report of this species damaging trees in Minnesota. And our colleagues in Wisconsin, that is, and Iowa also found these caterpillars defoliating walnut in their states. But in 2021, caterpillar feeding was not as extensive and was lighter in Minnesota. Now, moving on to our next insect, damage from the Aspen blotch miner can typically be observed most years, and it's very common on trembling aspen from July to October in northern Minnesota counties in the past few years. The extent of damage in 2021 appeared to have slightly decreased compared to 2019. The aspen blotch miner caterpillar feeds on the tissue between the upper and lower surface of aspen leaves. This feeding creates yellow blotches on leaves, which eventually become brown in September. And you can see that here in the photo. The blotches can be numerous and concerning looking, but trees can tolerate the damage and impact to aspen health and vigor is minimal. However, one potential concern is aspen trees stressed by both blotch miner and forest tent caterpillar could have compounded stress that might lead to dieback. And now that I've mentioned forest tent caterpillar, it's time to move on to our last section, the standard forest health issues that we expect to see each year. So starting off with forest tent caterpillar, which primarily feeds on the leaves of aspen, oak, birch, and basswood. This insect has remained low across most of Minnesota in recent years, and defoliation decreased substantially from 2018 to 2019. Forest tent caterpillars defoliated over 9,000 acres of hardwood forest in 2021. And damage in most areas was light to moderate, but nearly 30% of the defoliation was considered severe. And most of this severe defoliation occurred from Aiken County in Aiken County, that is, in north central Minnesota. And interestingly, a Grand Rapids neighborhood, a number of caterpillars were actually great enough to cover the majority of roads. And you can see this in really high populations, but even a population of this size actually resulted in only trace defoliation that was not picked up by our aerial surveys. But based on past population levels, we do expect forest tent caterpillar to potentially peak again sometime between 2023, maybe next year, and 2029. And we might expect to see an uptick beginning next year based on past observations of population increases occurring after drought. And healthy trees can typically withstand forest tent caterpillar damage, but multiple consecutive years of heavy defoliation could lead to mortality and reductions in growth. And of course, stress can make defoliated trees further susceptible to other opportunistic pests and diseases. Now, moving on to spruce budworm, it is considered the most destructive pest of spruce and fir forests in eastern North America. And unlike other parts of the US, where budworm essentially disappears after large outbreaks, the budworm population in Minnesota has a continuing population that has been observed in the Arrowhead region since 1954. Spruce budworm has defoliated or killed an average of 282,000 acres of fir and spruce forest per year in northeastern Minnesota since 2018. This area is almost the size of Lower and Upper Red Lake combined. In Minnesota, outbreaks last about 8 years before moving on to a new area, and 30 to 40 years pass until spruce budworm returns again. And much of the present outbreak is in Lake County and the western part of Cook County. 2021, spruce budworm defoliated and killed 384,000 acres of fir and spruce forest. And this is the highest number of acres affected by spruce budworm since 1995. And this level of damage is not that unusual looking at the past. Large outbreaks have occurred in the past, and our forests have recovered from this insect. And most of the acres damaged in 2021 were only defoliated, but over 80,000 acres had a mix of mortality and defoliation. And that's where we can see the mark for 2021. And the impact of drought on spruce budworm is not well understood. It is possible that the past few years of dry weather may have magnified spruce budworm situation by increasing budworm production and negatively impacting their fungal populations, but we just don't know at this point. And the spruce budworm outbreak will probably continue to have a large impact next year as it moves farther into Cook County. And of course, another major ongoing issue in Minnesota forest health is the continued outbreak of eastern larch beetle, which began back in 2001. Now, eastern larch beetle is native to Minnesota and is known to attack weakened tamarack. Due to longer growing seasons, more than one generation per year of this insect can develop. And historically, tamarack has not faced repeated second generation beetle attacks in a single growing season. But since the beginning of the larch beetle outbreak, about 817,000 acres of the 1 million acres of tamarack forests in Minnesota have been impacted to some degree by eastern larch beetle. We mapped nearly 250,000 acres of mortality last year. And this is about the same as what was mapped during our last aerial survey in 2019. And again, we don't know exactly what happened in 2020 because we weren't able to fly. And from the aerial survey data, we saw that most of the stands were only lightly affected, meaning that anywhere from 1 to 30% of the trees in the stand show symptoms of infestation. There has been an upward trend in damaged acres since the beginning of outbreak in 2021, and we do expect that trend to continue. Future surveys will determine if the intensity of the larch beetle outbreak will continue at a similar rate in future years, so we'll have to keep an eye on the situation. But looking forward, based on past observations and recent research, eastern larch beetle attack is positively associated with warmer and drier years. So it is likely that conditions in 2022 did favor ELB. And research will be coming out from the University of Minnesota, providing information on the regeneration of tamarack and other species we're seeing in stands that were killed early on in the outbreak. The photo on the bottom right of this slide shows a beautiful tamarack flooring that is just one example of the products that are possible from tamarack, and the demand for tamarack as fuel wood is high. However, there are significant challenges in harvesting tamarack, exacerbating the effects of eastern larch beetle and limiting our opportunities to manage tamarack. And a recent study from Brian Alkema at the U of M and Sam Ward, formerly at Purdue, found that eastern larch beetle outbreaks are more likely to occur in areas previously defoliated by larch case bearer, which you can see here. A larch case bearer, which I fondly call the burrito of the forest world, is a non-native moth whose caterpillar feeds on tamarack needles. And in 2021, we mapped nearly 12,000 acres of defoliation, an increase from the over 7,000 acres mapped in 2019. And an increase in damage occurred in Beltrami, Koochiching, and St. Louis counties, as you can see here on this map. Now, moving on to another invasive species, this one much more well-known, emerald ash borer, of course. There are now 32 counties in the state that do have emerald ash borer, and several counties in southern Minnesota were newly quarantined for the insect in 2021. And as part of our aerial survey last year, the DNR mapped forests infested by emerald ash borer. Now, nearly 5,000 acres were visibly impacted from Houston and Fillmore counties north to Wabasha County, and roughly 1/4 of this area had moderate or heavy damage. That is 30% or more of these trees displayed symptoms of infestation. Now, when combining aerial surveys from 2016, 18, and 2021, when we flew over areas where EAB is present, aerial surveyors have mapped over 10,000 acres of forest with damage from emerald ash borer. And this is, we know, is an underestimate since our aerial surveys do not enable us to see all locations of emerald ash borer, and lightly infested or widely scattered ash cannot be detected from their air. And our team has also been working over the winter to survey for emerald ash borer on the ground in southern and central Minnesota. Now, moving on to another invasive species, a kind of an announcement to make about this name change. The Entomological Society of America has officially renamed Lymantria dispar to spongy moth. This insect, formerly known as gypsy moth, will shed the ethnic slur that was part of its name and will now be named after the spongy appearance of its egg mass. You can see that in the upper photo, that tan colored egg mass. And this name is actually more consistent with several other languages around the world. In Minnesota, Lake and Cook counties are currently quarantined for spongy moth, and an additional infestation was found at Palisade Head and Tetagooch State Park last year. And treatments to the area will potentially take place this year in 2022. And moving away from invasives, but ending on a positive note, I just had to, like forest tent caterpillar, jack pine budworm populations are at rock bottom. And jack pine budworm is a native moth whose caterpillar feeds on jack pine. In 2021, aerial surveys detected no jack pine budworm damage. However, there were reports from the ground of damage in Beltrami County for the second year in a row. No new locations were known to be defoliated, and attacks in Beltrami County occurred in areas directly adjacent to previous attacks. Now, jack pine budworm populations peak every 8 to 10 years in north central and in northwest Minnesota, and about every 24 years in northeast Minnesota. Their populations may peak again beginning in 2023 and 2025 in north central and northwest Minnesota, and potentially around 2031 in northeast Minnesota. So good news on the jack pine budworm front. And I just wanted to give you one more reminder of where you can sign up for our Forest Health newsletter and read our annual reports in case you're interested in delving further into the information I've shared today. And with that, thanks very much everyone for your time, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Well, Rachel, that was depressing, but awesome. Thanks for the presentation, and thanks for ending on a high note. That was good. I'm just putting in the chat the link that to the page that you just shared with the source for those reports, and where you can sign up for your updated emails or your email updates and so on.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I always feel a little bit bad. We often come from a place of sharing bad news from the forest health world, but I'm glad you found it interesting at least.
Yeah, well, it's not your fault, and we do appreciate the updates. These are very helpful. I know these are popular talks, and we're really glad to have you doing this. We do have a couple of really good questions here that I'll go to next, and I'll encourage folks to post additional questions. You can either use the chat, or if you prefer, you can click Q&A. That might be at the bottom of your screen, or it might be in a bar at the top of your screen, depending on how you've got things organized. So I'll be watching for additional questions, but we'll start with a couple. First, Rachel, have we had enough moisture since last fall to safely thin red and white pine this summer, assuming we follow the 3 weeks and 3 inch rule about removing wood and slash? Or should we tighten the 3-3 rule, or just wait until September, or something else? What about thinning red and white pines?
Yeah, so we are actually, we've put together a fact sheet for red pine, bark beetle, and drought. And I'd be happy to share copies of that with people. It provides some good background information and some specific management recommendations. So what we recommend for folks really depends on your situation, you know, how large of a land base you have, how frequently you can monitor your pine trees, and how quickly you can respond and salvage if you do encounter a rising bark beetle attack. So in some scenarios, it would make sense for some landowners that can't closely monitor and would have a harder time salvaging quickly, right? Because we do want to minimize impacts from that blue stain fungi in trees and getting quickly in salvage. So those are situations where it might make a lot of sense for those people to wait until after drought conditions have passed. But for others, we are recommending that it is fine to proceed. And of course, following our bark beetle guidelines, those are posted to our DNR Forest Health webpage. We do have a page specifically for pine bark beetle, and we do have a management page that does list out all of our guidelines. But I'd be happy to get out a copy. I can see, I don't know if we yet have that fact sheet posted to our website, and I know that our web coordinator at the DNR is out, but I can see if we can get that out quickly, and then folks could access that on our webpage. It's a really good set of materials.
Good. Yeah, I was just looking for it, and I did just put in the chat the link to your bark beetle page, but I didn't see a new fact sheet. There's a link there to management guidance, but I think that's more general bark beetle information. So Rachel, if that's ready and you want to send it to me and have me send it out to everyone who registered, I could do that, or we can do other things too. But
yeah, I'll check in with our team on that. I think that would be a good possibility. Thank you, Eli.
Great. Yeah, you bet. And our next question is on a similar theme. Will the late spring and extra spring moisture, we're all shaking our heads at whether spring's ever going to arrive, will those things help significantly to reduce bark beetle problems in red pine stands?
Yeah, you know, with drought, oftentimes the damage is already done, but it certainly can help, right? Any additional moisture we can get will, I think, lessen any continued impacts we see of the drought from last year. And I am waiting outside of my area of expertise. I am no meteorologist, but I have heard from meteorologists that looking back at historical data, we do often see these drought years kind of come in pairs. And we certainly see that looking back at some of our forest health annual reports. So we do expect that, especially in areas that have been dry for consecutive years in northern Minnesota, you know, there could be some ongoing impacts. We will expect that even if there are average levels of precipitation. But yeah, every little bit counts, and it is such an odd spring. I was just checking in with our state forest nursery. I help them out part-time, and they haven't even lifted trees yet. They're maybe hoping to get out into the fields next week. So very odd and very late spring. But on the flip side of that, actually moving to another organism, oak wilt, that is actually another good thing this year because it has delayed our typical risk period for oak wilt. So that runs generally from April through mid-July of this year. And the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in coordination with their extension, actually has posted a really interesting map, an interactive map. You can click on where you're at in the map and see if you are currently at risk for oak wilt. And that risk is actually currently sitting in southern Iowa still. So it's good to see that that risk is delayed this year as well.
Great. Well, surprisingly, I'm not seeing any other questions yet. So if folks have other questions, if you were just hoping someone else would ask, well, get going. Now is the time to post those. I will point out that some of you are interested, I know, in continuing education credits. I did just post a link in the chat to the continuing education credit request form. We are asking, as always, we're asking that you complete that form. It's very quick and easy, and we'll get those credits recorded.
Yeah,
So
and if you're
yeah.
like me and you think of a great question 10 minutes after the talk ends, my email's up there. Feel free to email me. I'd be more than happy to continue the conversation after the webinar today.
Great. And we have also been recording this presentation. As always, you'll find the full recording on the event page on the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative website. I'll put that there. Not seeing any other questions, which again surprises me. There was some really neat stuff there, from the extent of squirrel bark damage, for goodness sake, to just all sorts of other interesting information. You and your team really do an outstanding job, and we're glad to have you to share this information with us.
Yeah, thank you, Eli, and we're always happy to help, and that is certainly, an aspect of the job that keeps it very interesting. You never know what you're going to expect in any given year, and it keeps things very exciting.
Yeah, great Zoom backgrounds too. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions at this point, and with that in mind, I guess we can move on. Rachel, Dube, thank you again for your time, and I know your whole team contributes to these to this content, so thanks to all of them who you introduced at the top. Quick reminder, if you're in the Ely area this Thursday night, just a couple of days, from 6 to 8 p.m. at the Historic State Theater, there's going to be, I know it's going to be very good, session on Indigenous perspectives on the use of fire, highlighting the Ashkenazi video that I hope many of you have seen on YouTube. And we encourage you to attend. I'll be up there and I'm looking forward to it. This coming Monday afternoon at 3:30, Kurt Kipfmueller from the University of Minnesota Department of Geography is going to be presenting on stories from the rings of trees. Really fascinating research that he and others have been involved in for years about human cultural uses of fire and how that has shaped our northern Minnesota forests. Lots more other things coming up as well that you can find on our website. And again, continuing ed credits, look for that link in the chat and fill that out as soon as you can so that we can get those processed. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks everyone for coming, and I hope we'll see you next month. I also did put a link into our entire 2022 webinar series, and we hope to see you online soon. If you pay once now, you're good for the whole year. You don't have to register for every webinar. We will automatically send you connection instructions for every monthly webinar if you've registered. Any closing thoughts, Rachel, or are we done?
Oh, go forth and hope for rain, everyone.
Awesome.
Yeah,
well said. All right, bye everybody.
Bye.